In the last lesson, we learned the basics for how to build forms using Vuetify. However, we're still missing one key component to form design, which is form validation. In this lesson, we'll be learning about how to build custom rules for each individual component and how to utilize resets to allow us to reset validation or reset the form entirely. And finally, we'll learn how to programmatically validate our form on demand. Let's jump right in. Here's the current state of our signup page. You'll see that when we click submit, the entire page refreshes, but we need the email and agree to terms and conditions filled out before we allow the user to submit. To learn how to do this, let's jump into the docs. Under the forms component, there's one line in particular I want you to pay attention to. All input components have a rules prop which takes an array of functions. This is the key that will allow us to write custom rules for each input. Let's see what's happening underneath the hood. In this simple example, we have a text field with the label of name and the rules v-bound to the data property name rules. As you can see, it takes an array and we have a single rule in here which checks whether or not name exists. Let's break it down a little bit more. For each rule, it is typically defined using an arrow function, where it is always passed the input value which you can name whatever you want. To be explicit, I'm calling it value. To the right of the arrow, this is a shorthand for saying return either the left if this is true, or the right if the left side is false. On the left, this is typically the rule that you want to validate. You'll notice here that there's a double exclamation point. This is a JavaScript shorthand for converting any value into its Boolean type. If the rule is false, then the string returned will display as the error message to users. In the scenario where you have more than one rule, Vuetify only displays one error at a time. First, it will validate whether or not the name has any input and will first render name is required. Once the user types one character, which passes the first rule, Vuetify will go on to the next error and then display the next one. In this case, minimum length is 2. Let's jump into our code editor to add validation to our form. We'll start with the checkbox input and assign it a v-model of agree to terms so we can track the value of the checkbox, and we'll set it to a default of false. Next, we'll add a rule props with the v-bind directive to agree to term rules, and we'll add the HTML attribute required. Inside of our data store, we'll now define agree to term rules and give that an array just as specified in the docs. We'll want to check the value and ensure that it's true. If it is not true, we want to inform the user that you must agree to the terms and conditions to sign up for an account. Jumping into our browser, you'll see now that when I check agree to terms and condition, it's fine, but once I uncheck it, the error message appears as desired. And once we check it, the error message goes away. Next, let's try something a little more complicated, email validation. We'll start by adding a v-model of email so we can track the value. We'll add a rules prop and v-bind it to email rules. And just like before, we'll add the required HTML prop. Let's hide agree to term rules so that it's easy to read. And now we'll define email with a default value of an empty string and email rules with a set of rules. We'll want to check that the email is required, so we'll do a simple Boolean. Next, we'll want to make sure that the email has a proper username, so we'll make sure that the @ symbol has an index that is not 0. Next, we'll want to make sure the email includes an @ symbol. Next, we'll want to make sure that the user actually types a domain name so that they don't put the @ symbol and period right next to each other. Finally, we'll want to make sure that the email has a proper domain name. which should be at minimum 2 characters, which is why we're testing it against a length of -3. And with that, we have all of our email validation. Let's see how that looks in the browser. Focusing on our email input, when we focus away from our input, you'll see that the first error message appears as expected. Next, when we have an @ symbol, you'll notice that the error message has detected no username exists. Once we have our @ symbol, it'll request a custom domain so that the @ and period cannot be next to each other. And then finally, it'll look for a domain extension, which we can see here is the bare minimum requirements for any email. Next, we'll want to talk about how to reset the form, particularly validation and the form itself. In the Forms API section, you'll see under Functions that there are 2 functions we should pay attention to: reset and reset validation. Let's implement this in our form to see how it works. We'll start by adding a V button with the color of warning, which will serve as our button for reset validation. Then we'll add another V button with the color of error for resetting the form itself. Then we'll add a click handler for the reset validation method, which we'll define later. And we'll add a click handler for reset form to the reset button. We'll now collapse the data store so that it's easier to see what's going on. We'll add the methods property to our component instance and define reset validation as a function. What we want to be able to do is refer to the form directly in order to call the functions that Vuetify specified in the docs. In order to do this, we use this $refs. For those who are new to this $refs, this is a Vue instance property that contains DOM elements and component instances that have been registered with the ref attribute. In other words, this is not something specific to Vuetify. This is a technique that you can use in any Vue app. For more information, check out the docs in the Vue API. With that, let's go ahead and define our ref property on our vForm. We'll start by collapsing vForm to make it easier to follow. And then we'll add the ref prop and give it a value of signup form in camel case. Now, all we have to do to refer to it is access it using the dot notation. So this $refs.signupform.resetValidation, which we saw in the docs earlier. So now, in reset form, we'll do the same thing. This $refs.signupform.reset. Let's jump into our browser and see what happens. First, I'll go ahead and queue an error in the email and queue an error in the agreed to terms and conditions. You'll see that when I click Reset Validation, it clears out the error messages, but the form inputs are still there. However, when I click Reset, the entire state of the form gets reset. And that's all there is to resetting your form. Our buttons are bumped up a little close, so let's fix that real quick. To fix the spacing on our buttons, all we have to do is add a class of margin right 4 units. This is a utility class that's offered to us in Vuetify. And with that, our buttons look great. The final piece of this lesson is learning how to validate our form on command. Back in the form components doc, when we check the props, you'll see that it has a prop of value which returns a boolean representing the validity of the form. In the functions, we also have the validate function, which will return a boolean based on whether the form is valid or not. So let's hook that up into our signup form. Since it uses the value prop, we can go ahead and use the vModel directive in order to track its value through Vue. We'll use the data property formValidity, which we'll define now. Once we expand the data store and collapse our rules so that it's easier to follow, we'll add our formValidity and give it a default of false. Next, we'll go ahead and disable the submit button based on this formValidity, since we only want the form to be submitted if the form is valid. Jumping into our form, you'll see now that the Submit button is disabled by default. However, once we fill out the necessary fields, our Submit button is enabled as desired. Next, we'll want to use the Validate function that we just learned about. So we'll add another V button with a class of margin right 4 and a color of success with the text Validate Form, and we'll add the click handler Validate Form, which we'll define now. After collapsing our data store, we'll define Validate Form as a function using the same syntax as before, this.refs.signupform.validate. Now, when we jump into our form, you'll see that if we click on the Validate Form button, it'll immediately trigger that validation and the error messages will appear without any user input. This is useful for times when you need to do things like trigger a notification or change the state on another component based on whether the form is valid. And with that, our sign-up form is equipped with all the bells and whistles for form validation. Congratulations! You now possess all of the fundamental knowledge that you need to successfully build forms and validate them using Vuetify. For those of you who want to use third-party validation libraries like Vuelidate or vValidate, be sure to check out the Vuetify docs for more information. See you in the next lesson. Vroom, 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 vroom. And vroom. Everyone revving their engines on the street. I cannot wait till I move.